Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hey friend, Esther here, and I am coming to you solo today. This episode is releasing the week of Thanksgiving. If you're listening in real time and you're here in the US, we are celebrating Thanksgiving this week. So first of all, I want to start off by saying how grateful I am for you. Honestly, the past 2+ years of doing this podcast have been so rewarding for me. Yes, it has been a lot of work, but when I get to hear from you about how the podcast has made a difference or how a guest has really spoken to you, it just reminds me of how grateful I am to get to do this. So just yesterday, I actually had one of you reach out to me on my website and you left me a voicemail. And by the way, did you know you can do that? You can actually go to estherlittlefield.com and you'll see on the sidebar, there's a place where you can send a voicemail. So just a quick note in case you didn't know. But whoever that was, you didn't share your name, but you shared with me that the episode you listened to was just what you needed to hear that day. And this was so encouraging for me to hear because sometimes when I'm sitting here behind a microphone all by myself, I really have no idea if what I'm saying is making sense or if it's really going to make an impact. So it's such a wonderful experience when you reach out, when you share. And I just want to let you know whether you've done that or not, I am just grateful that you choose to take the time to listen to this show. Now, let me tell you why I'm here solo today and what we're doing in this episode. This is going to be a little bit different because I'm actually going to be playing for you an episode that I recorded originally on my other podcast, the Christian Woman Business Podcast. So if you already listened to that podcast, then this is going to be a repeat. It was episode 20 on that show, which came out a few weeks ago. So just to let you know what it's going to be about, back in episode 125, I shared with you about this idea of getting out there and starting to share your message. So you as a leader, it's possible that you might have something in your heart that you want to share. And so I talked about some tips and some advice on getting started, 4 different ways to actually start sharing your message. And I also talked about some specific avenues for some of those different ways that I discussed. And one of the avenues I mentioned on that episode was podcasting. And so I thought it might be helpful for you to hear a little bit more kind of behind the scenes of how having a podcast has benefited me over the past 2.5 years and some of the things I've learned along the way. So that's what is happening in today's episode. You are going to hear episode 20 of the Christian Woman Business Podcast. So, some of the times I'm talking, I'll actually be referring to this podcast. So just be aware, don't get confused. It's actually just a replay of that episode, but I'm talking about the 9 benefits of having a podcast and how it has really changed a lot in my life and in my business. So if you have ever considered starting a podcast, this is definitely a must listen. If you're not interested in podcasting at all, feel free to skip this episode, go back and find a different episode to listen to. And one last thing, if podcasting is on your radar, then I want you to check out the show notes of this episode because I am about to release a resource about launching a podcast. And so you can check that out at podcastinaweekend.com or just go right to the show notes for this episode. So it's not going to be available right when you listen to this if you're listening in real time, but it should be out as long as everything goes the way I have planned. I'm hoping to have it ready by Friday, November 27th. Of 2020. So hopefully it's going to be up and ready, but if it's not ready yet, the wait list is there so you can hop on and grab that wait list. So let's go ahead and dive in to this episode with the benefits of starting a podcast. I am back this week with you, and I am excited to chat with you again about one of my favorite topics, podcasting. Now, the past few weeks, we have been talking some about this topic, and I shared with you that this is going to be the theme for a little while. So this is great for someone if you are considering starting a podcast, if it's ever been on your radar, or even if you already have a podcast. Some of the things that I will share, I hope will be beneficial to you. All right, so I'm super happy that you're here with me. Now, in episode 19, I talked about whether podcasting is right for you, like 3 ways to determine if it's right for you. If you haven't listened to that one and you're kind of on the fence about whether or not you want to have a podcast, then check that episode out, because I gave you some things that maybe you haven't thought about before in terms of ways to decide if it's for you. Today, what I want to do is share with you some of the benefits of having a podcast based on my own experience, as well as the experience that I've seen from others, from clients, and from students that I've had, and just other podcasters that I know. Because one of the questions that I sometimes hear, and I even heard it recently during my mastermind experience, is, why should I have a podcast? Like, what is different about podcasting, or what's better about podcasting than simply doing what I'm already doing? Maybe I have a Facebook Live show and that's working, and why should I consider a podcast? So today, what I want to do is share with you some of the things that I have found through the past 2+ years of podcasting, and share with you kind of why I think this is such a great platform to use to share your message. So first, what I want to do is give you a little bit of a backstory of how my first show got started. So I first got a clear vision for the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast in January of 2018. It was at that point that I decided to change my whole blog from what it had been before to having it be under my name. So estherlittlefield.com is where my website lives now, my main website. And I got the vision for the podcast at that time. And then I didn't launch the podcast until July of 2018. So it took about 6 months to fully plan and prepare for my podcast launch. So I went into the podcast with a plan, but also hoping and believing that it would make an impact. But I wasn't entirely sure how it would turn out. My co-host Holly and I, we knew that this was something God had put on our hearts, and I sensed that it was leading in the right direction, that we were kind of onto something. But I still had that fear. I still had that concern of, is this actually going to do anything? Like, is this going to help people? Is this going to make a difference? I didn't know. I just knew I was going to put in my best effort and allow God to bring the results. So let's get into what some of those results and benefits have been that we have seen from the podcast. This is in no particular order until the last point that I'm going to make, which I feel like is the most important. But the other ones I'm just sharing in the order that they came to me. So the first benefit is improving speaking skills. I have found that podcasting has helped me improve in my speaking very much. So I'm a writer first. That I've shared that before, that I tend to write my podcast episodes out before I, record them, because writing comes more naturally to me than speaking. And although I've done speaking and have grown in some of my public speaking skills over the years, podcasting has really allowed me to develop this ability even more. So it's definitely different than standing in front of a large room of people, but podcasting has helped me to develop in my ability to formulate ideas and structure my talks and kind of think through how can I best communicate a topic or a point. And specifically, one benefit of podcasting is that it has helped me to drop some of the crutch words that I used to say a lot. Now, I'm not saying that they're entirely gone. I know that I still have certain words that I lean on and that I say. It's kind of something that all of us do. But I edited the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast for a full year before I hired that out. And I will tell you, there's not much that I have found to be more effective in helping you realize how annoying you are when you speak than editing your own podcast. And so by editing my own podcast, I picked up on every single time I would say or so or like or right. And I started to learn how to drop those words from my speaking, at least when I'm speaking, on a podcast or in a public setting. All right. So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is confidence. One of the things I talk about on this other podcast, my first podcast, is this idea of leading with confidence. I truly believe that once you get the right perspective about confidence and where it comes from and the source, then the biggest way to develop that confidence is to start practicing doing things that cause you to rely on God. And so rather than relying on myself, podcasting has helped me to rely on God and trust Him for the outcome, which has grown my confidence. So I've seen this experience develop my confidence and be able to help me understand that God is going to provide. He's going to use my willingness to speak and to share a message, and He's going to grow me in the process. So that has been really fun to experience. The third benefit is opportunities, increased opportunities. So podcasting has brought me a ton of opportunities that I didn't foresee when we started the podcast. One obvious one is that I have been able to be a guest on other people's podcasts. So naturally, when you're a podcaster, you start to develop relationships with other podcasters. You get to know them. You start to talk with them. You start to kind of find out what they're doing and how you might change things, and you learn from one another. But at the same time, naturally through that process, you start to realize, oh, I should have you on my podcast, or, hey, do you want to be on my podcast? And you get those invitations naturally, and podcasters just kind of have this, this culture within ourselves where we kind of get it. So when you are a podcaster, you know what goes on behind the scenes of a podcast. You understand the amount of work and effort that goes into a podcast. So personally, I have found that, other podcasters make great guests usually. And often I find that I am being invited to be on other people's podcasts without even really pursuing it. Sometimes it's a natural progression of the relationship. So I have also received opportunities for speaking engagements and summits and other online virtual events. And some of these, again, are things that I didn't really pursue. They kind of came to me as a result of me having my podcast. So opportunities, and there's many more that I'm not even mentioning, a lot of other types of opportunities that I'm probably not thinking of that have come as a result of having a podcast. Okay, next, this is probably one that you actually would be thinking about or want to think about if you're considering a podcast, is business growth. I always want someone to consider when they are looking to start a podcast, what their goal is for the podcast. And I think it's really important to know where you're headed with your podcast, because if you don't know that, it's so easy to get discouraged and get off track and kind of just throw in the towel. So when I started my podcast, I knew at the beginning it was a passion project. This meant I was going to be investing a lot of time, resources, and even money into the podcast, and that it might not generate any income right away. And I was okay with that. But over the course of the past 2 years, I have been able to transition the podcast into a key marketing tool for my overall business. And if you've followed me for any length of time, you know my business has shifted and changed in the past 2 years. And even here in 2020, I've made some adjustments. So now everything is under my umbrella brand of Esther Littlefield. And I kind of have 3 legs of that brand. One is the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast and resources and support for women in leadership. The second kind of leg is more just general online business, which is what this podcast is about. And then I have my third leg, which is more related to podcasting specifically, consulting and courses and resources for people who are wanting to start or, grow their podcast. So all that to be said, the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast and the growth that I've had there with the audience has helped me to develop new revenue streams and products and services. So just as an example, I didn't have these 3 things when I started the podcast. I did not have the Confident Leader Club, which I now have. I didn't have my course, which is kind of my main course for leadership, Confident Leader Catalyst. And I didn't have my mini course, which I now have, and that is Confident Conversations. All of that came as a result of starting the podcast and as a result of doing the next thing that I'm going to talk about. So maybe I should have flip-flopped these in this order, but I'll just go with it. So another benefit is refining my message. So podcasting has really helped me to refine what it is that I actually want to say. What do I want to be known for? What do I want to communicate? Who am I speaking to? I had to get clear on a lot of that before starting the podcast, but a lot of it has come during the podcasting experience. So as I've talked with different leaders and as I have sat down to prepare and write out content for the podcast, I've had to really get clear on what is the main goal or what am I really passionate about sharing with my audience? What do I feel God is leading me to share? What is He teaching me that I want to pass on? So this process, I don't think would have happened if I had just been writing. There's something about the experience of sitting down and talking, whether it's by yourself or with a co-host or with a guest, that helps you to sort of work through different ideas. So I have in this process customized or developed my frameworks and my approaches to different topics. So I've kind of mentioned this with the courses that I've created, but I developed the Confident Leader Framework, and that is something that underpins my Catalyst program. And it's also kind of the foundational things that I believe in terms of how I look at leadership as a Christian woman. And I developed that because I sat down to write an episode and I wanted to have a way to look at this concept of leadership. So the podcast helped me to do that. I also came up with something that's called the Stages of Confident Leadership. I created that Confident Leadership quiz in preparation for an episode. And so again, having the need for the content in the episode helped me to develop this quiz. I also have created that Confident Conversations mini course, and a lot of the content in there is out of the things that I have worked through as I have developed the podcast content. So refining your message is a benefit for you. This is especially important if you think you want to write a book or, be a speaker. Having a clear message and knowing what you could talk about for hours or months or years is super important. And if you sit down to write a podcast episode and you can't come up with anything on that topic, then maybe you shouldn't write a book about it, So this really helps you to prepare and figure out what your message is. Okay, another benefit, growing your audience. So when I started my podcast, I knew that one of my goals would be to grow my audience. And, I have this goal of writing a book eventually. And so I knew that publishers look at numbers, they look at your audience. And as much as we might not like that, it's a reality of the industry and of being able to sell a book. You need people who would actually be interested in reading the book. It kind of makes sense. So I did have that intention in mind when I started my podcast. I knew that I needed to grow my audience. And so I have seen growth in my email list. I've seen growth in my social platforms. And my favorite thing that I've seen, which is part of my social, but I started a Facebook group before I launched the podcast, and it's now over 1,600 women. And I love that group. It's my favorite place to hang out other than within, my paid programs that I have with women. That's my favorite place to hang out with my audience because we just get to have conversations and real connection that I don't think I had with my audience before my podcast. Okay, another benefit is connecting with leaders that I admire. So this has been one of the best parts of having a podcast is that you can invite other people in your industry onto your show that you normally might not get to sit down and talk to. So, you might not be able to call someone up and invite them just to talk to you on the phone for 30 minutes or 60 minutes. But if you have a podcast, you can invite them onto your show. It gives you a platform where you can have a conversation with them that, will benefit you because you'll probably learn something, but you'll also be benefiting your audience. So not everybody will say yes to be on your show. I just want to say that. I haven't had a ton of quote unquote celebrities or quote unquote big names. I don't really like using those terms, but I think you know what I mean. I haven't had a ton of people who have a humongous audience themselves. However, I have made some amazing connections with women who weren't even on my radar before the podcast. And now, after having them on my show as a guest, I've been able to just find so much benefit from what they're doing and what they're offering. And I've been able to stay in touch and continue the relationship. And again, that wouldn't have happened without the podcast. Another benefit is my relationship with my co-host. Now, this is unique to me in my situation as someone who has a co-host, but I just want to mention this because I think if you have a podcast, sometimes you might have a co-host or you might have a team or other people that you're working alongside. And I knew going into my podcast that I did not want to do this alone. And that's something I would encourage you to do is even if you're doing a solo podcast, to not go into the podcasting journey by yourself. Have some people alongside of you. So I knew that it's a ton of work to launch a podcast. I also knew that just me solo might not make the best show. And so as I shared on episode 19, I listened to podcasts for a long time before starting my own. And I knew that I wanted to have a co-host. I felt like if I found someone who I had a good rapport with, it could be a lot more fun than doing it by myself. And the first person that I thought of when I was thinking about who that person could be was my friend Holly. And I asked her if she would be interested in being my co-host. And I don't think she even, let me finish my explanation or my sentence before she said yes. She just jumped in and said yes. And we spent the next several months, working on it and developing the ideas and all of that together. And so we have always had so much fun together. And we've also had a lot of deep conversations. And so I knew that it would be a really great connection for this podcast. Now, I just want to mention a little caveat here. I do think that if you are going to have a co-host, there's a lot of considerations to look at, and that's like a whole separate conversation. So I wouldn't just jump into a co-host situation unless you have some time to work through like how it's going to look legally, financially, all of that. But, again, that's a separate conversation. What I have found, the benefit of having a co-host on my other podcast is just that our friendship has deepened and we have had so much fun together. We have spent so many hours off air, working through topics and laughing and crying and doing all kinds of crazy stuff just in preparation for the podcast. And a few months after we launched the podcast, she moved away. She moved to Florida. And so the podcast helped us to stay in touch. And like I said, has deepened our friendship even across the miles. So that was something that has just been such a blessing. All right, my last benefit. I think this is number 8, but I might have gotten to number 9. I'll have to double check the numbers at the end. But my last benefit that I want to share with you that I have found from podcasting is that I have been able to make a bigger impact by sharing the message that I believe God has given to me and sharing it with a wider audience than I could before. So I believe that my podcast has given me a chance to reach more women than I was going to reach just by blogging. Of course, I do believe blogging can be a great avenue, and many people reach thousands, if not millions of people through their blogs. But personally, for me, I have found that I've been able to connect with my audience on a deeper level through podcasting. I've gotten replies and reviews and comments that have just really moved me. There are times that I sometimes wonder, if it's worth it, if the time and the energy is worth it, and whether what I'm doing is making a difference. But then I just look at some of those messages. I look at some of those comments that have come in, and I'm reminded that God is using my podcast to make an impact. And it's probably a bigger impact than I actually am aware of. And so that could be the same for you. If God has put a podcast on your heart, on your mind, I just want to encourage you to consider this. Consider that might be the right next step for you, for your business, for your content. And I do want to let you know that in addition to the episodes that I'm sharing here on the podcast, I am going to be creating something specifically for you. In the past, I've had a group program that I've done that's been kind of a really big production. It's been 8 weeks long, and I have loved that when I've run that live. My students who have gone through that have found it super helpful. But I've also come across people who just want something fast and just like the simplest path to getting their podcast launched possible. And so, they have an idea and they're ready to get it out into the world, but they just need to know, what do I need to do? Just tell me the steps, show me the things that I need to do. And so I am working on an option, a resource that I'm creating that will help you do that. And I'm working on it being simple and an easy to follow path that won't be overwhelming. Because I know a lot of you are super strapped on time. You don't have a lot of extra time to give, but you do want to get this podcast idea into the world. I'm still finalizing the details of the name and all of that, but I'm going to do my best to have the waitlist page up by the time this podcast goes out. So head to the show notes for this podcast episode. You can find the show notes in your podcast app, wherever you're listening, or you can go to my website, christianwomanbusiness.com/20, because this is episode 20. So anytime you want to find the notes on my main website for the podcast, it's christianwomanbusiness.com/ and then just put the number of the episode and you'll find the show notes. So I'm going to do my best to get that waitlist page up for you so that you can just get on that list and let me know that you're interested in that resource. Again, it's going to be a smaller, simpler version of what I've done before in the bigger 8-week program. So I'm excited to share it with you and, share all the things that I know will help you to have a super successful podcast launch. All right. Thank you so much, friend, for being here with me, for just joining me on this journey. I appreciate you as a listener. I know that you have choices of what to listen to and how to spend your time. So thanks for being here. I can't wait to talk to you next week. Until next time, keep shining online. Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.